and welcome to our panel on border crossings, refugees, jihadists, money, and arms. My name is Ayari, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. I'm currently a freshman and a member of the Colloquium class this year. I think I'm going to study international relations and environmental studies, but that could change tomorrow, granted that I'm a freshman. As some of you may know, the Institute for Global Leadership's tagline just so happens to be thinking beyond boundaries, acting across borders. Also, oddly appropriate to explain the exact nature of our topic today. In broad terms, we have seen how the porous borders of MENA countries have resulted in fluidity of movement throughout the region. Long-standing conflict in countries has created an influx of displaced people forced to move from their country of origin to a new host country. Increased movement of jihadists from around the world across the region, a monetary tug-of-war between nations and actors, as well as an exchange of arms. In hosting this panel today, we hope to explore how each of these categories are crossing state lines, why they're doing so, the relationship with one another, and the implications of the nature of the border crossings in the Middle East. Before I move forward, I would like to remind you of the structure of the panel. We will begin by allowing each of our distinguished guests to have approximately 12 minutes to present their opening remarks. We will then allow the panelists to ask questions of each other, followed by student presentations and opening it up to the audience for questions. So, without further ado, I would like to start with Michaël Béchir Ayari. Mr. Ayari is a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Tunisia, as well as an analyst for the Institute of Research and Study of the Arab and Muslim World in Aix-en-Provence. He holds a PhD in political science from Aix-en-Provence. I knew something would be mispronounced. Thank you. And has served as a scientific officer of the Summer Academy of the European Inter-University Center for Human Rights and Democratization for a program entitled Good Governance in the Maghreb Region, Good Governance, State, and Civil Society in Venice, Italy. In 2009, he served as a statistical consultant for a study, Muslims in Cities, Social Confusion, Participation, and Identity, in coordination with IRMOM and the EU Monitoring and Advocacy Program for the Open Society Institute. In addition to everything else, he has also authored and collaborated on numerous publications about migration, politics, and the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Thank you very much. Sorry for my French accent. I hope you'll be able to understand me. We are a crisis group. There are 3 years that we are in Tunis. It's our 5th report about Tunisia, and the last one is the core of the subject. It's unfortunately there is no English version. There is just a French one and Arabic one. The title is Tunisia Borders, Jihad and Contraband. So we do the field work of 7 months to do that. I've been to the borders, to the Libyan part in the south and to the Algerian parts in the west. The main argument of my presentation will be to say that in terms of managing the border, it's not just a security question, it's a social question too. And I try to demonstrate that with the example of Tunisia. So, Tunisia is, everybody knows Tunisia now because of the Arab Spring. It's a small country. It means that there is just 11 million of people. It's a country, in fact, of borders. It means it's enclosed between 2 major regional actors, which are Libya and Algeria. It shares 459 kilometers of frontiers with Libya. We know that Libya there is a large instability, and 956 kilometers with Algeria. And Algeria, we know too that there is an uncertain future about Algeria. There is also 1,298 kilometers of coast, Mediterranean coast, and Tunisia is 140 kilometers from Europe, from Sicily. So you can understand that lots of people are afraid that if Tunisia is destabilized, it means that Sahelistan, Sahelistan that we call in the Sahel, the mix between jihad and contraband, will be at the door of Europe. So there is a strategic need to stabilize Tunisia. Politically in Tunisia, we know that the first step has been reached with the success of the constitutional process, but things are not over. Now we wait for the elections, and we know that if the constitutional process have the capacity to stabilize, the election is not always the case. It has the capacity to stabilize and destabilize. However, now the main important question is this question of border. It's an important challenge in Tunisia. Why? Because in fact there are armed groups in border areas. They have conducted attacks against members of the National Guard, the army and police. There is the problem of fighters, jihadist fighters who went to fight in Syria and are going to come back in Tunisia. And there is the problem of weapons trafficking that is new in Tunisia, and it's military equipment from Libya. And there is now the drug trafficking from Morocco and from Libya too. We have cannabis from Morocco, and we have chemical pills, things like that from Libya. But it's not, how could I say, it's not, it has not overwhelmed the country, you know. It means that it's marginal, you know, but it's new. It's the novelty that is worrying, you know. So the argument is to say how to control the border. Tunisia, they cannot close the border. It's impossible. Why? Because the border regions are the most poor regions, you know, and lots of people live thanks to this smuggling, you know. And we know, especially you know, it's the same thing in all the literature about the border studies, and you know that with Mexico, for example, and in Africa it's the same thing. It's the discourse of the state to say that it's going to eradicate contraband. It's to reassure, you know, people in the formal sector enterprise, but the state can just regulate contraband. And the problem of this contraband, of this smuggling, and that it makes the border more porous. And these borders are really porous. Why? Because smugglers can bring weapons. Smugglers who do traffic, you know, economic goods, you know, like for example, fruit, vegetables, things like that, or how do I say, fridge, things, electronic stuff. They can bring weapons too, they can bring drugs too, and they can cover jihadist action too. It's what happened. How to deal with that? Thanks to the field work, we can say that why is there has been an increase of this contraband since the fall of Ben Ali. You know, Ben Ali was the autocrat, you know, who fled the country in January 2011. So the first degree is to say, the first level is to say it's because the state is weakening. You know, the state is weaker than at this epoch, at this time, but it's not sufficient. Why? Because we have to understand that when there is this problem of smuggling, there are smugglers too, and there are dialogue and negotiations between the cartels and between the state. And under Ben Ali era, there was a kind of pact with the smugglers, you know, with the contraband cartels. It means, Ben Ali said, you know, they said, okay, you do what you want, you do smuggling, but in exchange, you don't bring weapons, you don't bring drugs, and you watch closely jihadists. It means that you will be responsible if there are security problems, and you have to watch jihadists. So there was a pact like that, and it lasted a long time, you know, because in fact the smugglers were very useful for intelligence. And they are all they're square, you know, but they look at what was happening. But with after the uprising, as you want, the revolution, there have been problems. There have been a reconfiguration, yeah, you say that, of the cartels in the West and in the South. In the West, it's commercial cartel. You know, these cartels, they were close to the family of the president's wife. You know. And now all the families of the president's wife, lots are in jail and lots left the country, you know. So just after the revolution, the uprising, there was a period of anarchy, you know, and a period of democratization of smuggling. You know, I say anarchy in the sense of smuggling, in the sense of smuggling. And it's a smuggler who said that, the democratization of smuggling, you know. It means that everybody became a smuggler, you know, it was very up to date. And after, there have been a new reconfiguration. It means that it was the go between the second-rank cartels who took the power, of the smuggling, in the West. In the South, it's much more anthropological, if you want. It's more tribal, because in the South we have tribes. And there have been, in the south of Tunisia, there is a powerful tribe that is historically in charge of contraband, historically in charge of parallel foreign exchange markets. It's the Tuazin, it's the Tuazin. And the Tuazin were close to another tribe in Libya, which was the Nuayen, okay? And these two tribes are considered as the son of Gaddafi, are very close to Gaddafi, in Libya. And effectively, they worked for Gaddafi. The Tuazin sent the supplies, to Tripoli right after the fall of Misrata and the Arab War, So first data. Second one, there is other tribes in Libya that took the control of the roads. The main tribe is the Zinten. It's the anti-Gaddafist tribes, that comes from Jbel Nefoussa. It's a mountain, not far from Tunisia. And this Zinten, they work with another tribe in Tunisia, okay? The name of the tribe is Ibel. Okay, we have to keep that in mind. This cartel, why this cartel is so important? These cartels are very important because in fact they have lots of capacity of control. It means that even if the borders seem porous, practically nothing can enter or leave the country without that they know it, we did the experience, it means that nothing is by chance, even if you can cross from one border to another border, they know everything will happen, and they were very close, as I said before, to the police, army, and national guards. The problem now, what do they say? The tribe in the south, the Tuazin, I told you that now they are concurrents, but they are challenged by another tribe. They say to the state, okay, if we lose our monopoly of contraband, we're going to close our eyes on everything. It means that we won't be able to see weapons, we won't be able to see drugs, we won't be able to see jihadists. So it's a kind of blackmail that is used inside negotiation. And what do they say in the West? In the West, it means at the Algerian border. It's different. They say, okay, you don't want to build infrastructures. It was a claim for the revolution, You don't want to address the regional development. You want to leave us in poverty. We have no electricity because it's not everybody or the population who are smugglers. There are lots of poor. They have no electricity. They say we have no gas. We got no water. We never mind what's going to happen. If there is weapon trafficking, it won't be against us. It will be against you. And it's not the same. You have your border and we have our borders. So it's a kind of we see that in Africa too. They act as resistance. They say, okay, it's not our state. They don't feel they are under the authority of the state because of that. And so they close their eyes too. It's the problem. So. If now all this data we try to correlate them with a larger question, like what happened everywhere in the Arab world and sometimes larger of the Arab world, there is a kind of, we can say it's a big word to say that, but a process of state retracting, on its center. It means because of economic problems, because of lots of things, the states tend to retract on the center, and there is the other part of the state that tends to be more autonomously regulated on an ethnical basis or tribal basis. It depends on the region. So, the idea, what to do, it's not to put army everywhere, it's not to put national guard everywhere, it's very costly, and for the moment Tunisia doesn't have the capacity to do that. And if they do that, people at the borders, they see that as a harassment. They say, okay, you want to control us? Okay, so we close our eyes too at the same moment. So they condemn to negotiate. They condemn to find a kind of win-win agreement. And how to do that? For us, that we saw in the report, it was in fact to use any excuse as possible, except any excuse to bring back the state, And how to do that except with security things? We can do that. They can do that with, for example, building a kind of free zone, like duty-free shop, for example, there, you know. They can do that by building they build confidence groups, you know, confidence group with smugglers. Sometimes they are responsible of associations in order to renew this pact that I told at the beginning, but formally, not informally like it was, but formally, and gradually regain control of the region, try to make that the smugglers will be the place that they can control the marchandises, the products, everything. So that is what is important. Because if they don't do that, what's going to happen? And Mali knew that at a different extent, okay, because Tunisia has a state, a real state. What happened? It means that these people, at the moment, people of the borders, they're going to, I just finished. They're going to turn themselves from the state. It means that we have to understand that there is the development in Tunisia, in 4 districts, the development of what we can call Islamo-gangsterism, you know? It means that Islamism, radical Islamism, is an excuse for gangsterism, and gangsterism is for the same thing. And these people, they can take control gradually of cartels who are not Islamists now, and maybe they will work with the borders people, and at this moment the situation will be uncontrollable, as we say in French. Thank you.
Welcome Ibrahim Warde. Ibrahim Warde is an adjunct professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where he teaches courses on Islamic banking and finance and business in the Islamic world, as well as informal and underground finance. He has previously taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, Sloan School of Management. Additionally, he is a consultant specializing in international finance and a course director for Euromoney training. Dr. Ward's book, Islamic Finance in the Global Economy, is now in its 2nd edition, and he has written other books including The Price of Fear, The Truth Behind the Financial War on Terror, and Islamic Economics. Last but not least, he also writes for the Le Monde Diplomatique, all right, good enough, where his articles have been translated into a mere 30 languages. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Ibrahim Warde.
Okay, thank you very much, Iris, and I'd like to thank Sherman also for this excellent organization of a very complicated event to put together. So my focus is going to be on money flows, and as you've heard, I've written a whole book on the subject of the financial war on terror, and this is a subject that is extremely interesting and important, and yet everything that most people think they know about money and terrorism is probably wrong. One thing I stressed in my book is the whole mythology that surrounds the subject, in that there've been a bunch of figures and statistics about money that were very simply invented by so-called experts and taken on a life of their own. And this explains why in my book there's probably the only reference to Stephen Colbert that appears in an academic book. I mentioned him and his concept of truthiness, where he says that certain facts are not true, but they're truthy, in that they could sound like they're true. And this is all over the place in the subject of terrorist financing. Because again, having explored that subject in depth, I tend to know what the origin of every factoid that is out there in the media, etc. So there's something fundamentally paradoxical about money, which is that money is everywhere and nowhere. It's everywhere because most of you are probably not aware of it, but every time you go to your bank, there are a number of things that the bank may tell you or may not tell you that are directly linked to the financial war on terror. For example, if some of you have opened a bank account, all the questions that you get asked about the origin of your money is a result of the post-September 11 environment, something called Know Your Customer, that every banker is taught right at the beginning of their job. There's also something called SARs, for Suspicious Activities Reports, which means that if you receive a financial transfer above a certain amount, or if you make a cash deposit at your bank beyond a certain amount, then the bank is required to report you without telling you. Okay, and so this is what the SARs are about. So the financial war on terror, again, affects every aspect of your life, not only domestically, but also internationally. There's a financial transfer system that's called SWIFT, the SWIFT system that's based in Belgium. And since September 11, all the SWIFT operations are being monitored in the US. So we hear a lot in the wake of the Snowden affair about this massive surveillance. And it actually started with financial flows. Okay, so financial flows are extremely important in terms of the consequences of this attempt to control them. Yet at the same time, and this is really where the paradox lies, very little of what was done was effective, in that the initial goal of imposing financial control was to starve Al-Qaeda of funding. And nobody can disagree with that objective. The only problem is that Al-Qaeda, despite, again, the chest thumping by the so-called financial warriors, to the effect that we've eliminated Al-Qaeda because of those financial controls, Al-Qaeda, unfortunately, is alive and well, including in regions where it was not present 10, 12 years ago. Okay, so you hear now about Al-Qaeda in Yemen, you hear about Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, you hear about Al-Qaeda in sub-Saharan Africa, about Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, whereas all of those things did not exist before. So that tells us something about the success, quote unquote, of the financial war. At the same time, however, and this is the essential part, there's been a lot of collateral damage, in that if you look at the ways in which, say, Islamic charities and other groups were targeted, and this had lots of unintended consequences as well, because a lot of the money that should have been above ground has gone underground. Okay, so that made the task of controlling the money flows extremely difficult. So now I want to jump ahead and talk about what has been happening in the wake of the Arab Spring on this topic of money flows. Now everybody knows that there's a lot of money that has been crossing borders in support of this or that faction. Okay, whether we're talking about Syria, about North Africa, etc. And the part that we should ponder is, again, this whole issue of money being everywhere and nowhere, because again, money by definition is largely invisible. But at the same time, the impact is huge in terms of the balance of forces in every one of those countries. So I'm going to talk about, again, three broad models of sending money overseas. One would be what we would call the American style, which was, for about 30 years now, there's been a tendency to quote the title of an interesting book on the subject, to divide the Muslim world between good Muslims and bad Muslims. And the implication of that division in two groups is to help the so-called good Muslims defeat the bad Muslims. Now, the problem with that reasoning is that those definitions keep shifting. So, for example, many of the Sunni extremists were good Muslims at the time of the Afghan jihad, and soon afterwards they became very bad Muslims. Okay? And we see this phenomenon in action. Now, there's a second model in terms of sending money overseas, and this is what may be called the Saudi model. And here, again, I don't want to spend too much time giving you the background information, but to summarize the context, when Saudi Arabia became part of the Afghan jihad, trying to help the Mujahideen in Afghanistan drive the Soviets out of the country, the way in which it was done was not only did the Saudi government send substantial amounts of money to the Mujahideen, but the Saudi government invited civil society, and especially the wealthy merchants, to do the same on their own. That is, to send money to the Mujahideen without any centralized control. And this is actually one reason why Osama bin Laden appeared kind of on the scene. He was essentially, at the beginning, in charge of the logistics, dealing with some wealthy Saudi families, such as his own family. And then he moved on to become a mastermind of terrorism. So the Saudi model is basically one of telling the rich people in the country, as well as various parts of the civil society, to be part on their own of this jihad. And incidentally, one reason why the Saudis did that in the 1980s was that there was a fiscal crisis at the time due to declining oil prices in the 1980s. So the government was not able to control the whole funding situation by itself. Then the third model is the Qatari model. Now, Qatar has, in the last few years, been leveraging its international position and its regional influence through, again, money. That is, by making all sort of donations to various groups, also by becoming a member of the global financial community. Qatar has been punching above its weight in terms of global affairs. And if you look at those three models, and one could add many more models in terms of money flows, then you can see how much money is flowing all over the place. And going back to my original statement that disbursing money seldom achieves the desired goal, okay? And the corollary to that is that there are lots of unintended consequences. You can get a sense of the mess we're in right now, okay? So the news are not good on the money front, despite what various bureaucracies in charge of controlling finances will tell you. That is, there's a lot of money floating around for a variety of reasons. And in every instance, it's making things worse. So I'm going to stop here. And if you want to know more about that later on, I'll answer questions related to that. Thank you very much.
Before our final panelist presents, I would like to welcome up Bruna Gaspar, one of our 2014 Colloquium members, to introduce Curt.
Hi. It is my pleasure to present the Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award. Jean Mayer was a distinguished scholar and one of Tufts' most celebrated presidents. He founded the nation's first graduate nutrition school and the veterinarian school at Tufts. He understood the importance of having distinguished scholars present in the campus in order to challenge and inspire our community. It is with this intent that we recognize Dr. Curt Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes has lived for over 30 years in the Middle East. There, he has served as assistant dean in the School of Public Health and at the American University of Beirut, and directed the Near East Foundation in Amman. In 1988, he founded Questscope, an international non-governmental institution with the goal of helping children and adolescents to get a second chance through non-formal education. Questscope's diploma is actually the first graduate equivalency diploma for primary school in the Middle East and has served hundreds of students. His work with Questscope has also named him Social Entrepreneur of the Year for the Middle East and North Africa by the Schwab Foundation. In recognition for his work with Questscope, EPIIC and NIMAP have put together a fundraiser for Questscope. The money we'll raise will go towards the construction of a sports complex in the Zaatari refugee camp for 400 youths who have come in conflict with the law. There's a table outside the auditorium where we are accepting donations. Today, Dr. Rhodes still directs Questscope. He is also a member of the Scientific and Technical Committee for the Child Protection Initiative, and for the Middle East, and an advisor for the World Bank and the Jordanian government. Therefore, on behalf of the Institute of Global Leadership and the EPIIC class of 2014, it is my great pride to present the Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award to Dr. Curt Rhodes. Demonstrated compassion and tenacity in creating a highly effective and determined organization dedicated to the survival and nurturing of the most vulnerable and disenfranchised.
Actually, this is somewhat symbolic of one's relationship with Sherman. The closer you get to him, the more you spend. So thank you very much, especially to your students, Sherman, and the impact that they've had on my life and the lives of our teams. Thank you. It's very interesting, and I really appreciate your comments, Béchir, about we're not dealing just with security questions, but we're dealing with social questions. And Ustaz Ibrahim, the idea of flow. So I want to talk a little bit today about the flow of people across borders that we call refugees. To be a refugee is to enter a long tunnel of waiting. You will be waiting to be healed physically. A young girl who is sitting in her living room with her sisters and brothers and mother and dad, suddenly a bomb falls on their house, her mother is killed, her sisters are killed, she loses an arm. And as a refugee, she is waiting. She received rehabilitation to learn to write with her other hand. She can write. She's going back to school to catch up. She will spend much of her life waiting because of the event that happened to her. You are waiting to come to grips spiritually with what has happened. Why my parents? Why my brothers? Why my sisters? Where? Why? What happened? You are waiting to belong. You're an unaccompanied minor, you don't have your parents, you don't have your brothers and sisters, you are at the mercy of whatever gang finds you in a refugee situation. You will be waiting to live. I think of a young girl with a spinal cord injury who's 12 years old. And the situation that she is in, there's not going to be the $150,000 a year that's required for appropriate treatment for spinal cord injuries for her. She will spend her life waiting. You may be waiting to earn. You could earn legitimately or illegitimately. But primarily, it's not going to be your first or maybe second or maybe third choice. You may be waiting to die. You may be waiting to die from some chronic disease or some injury that was inflicted upon you and you can't get treatment or adequate treatment. Or you may be waiting to die in war. Or you may be waiting to kill. If you are a refugee, you enter a long tunnel of waiting. And for whatever thing that you are waiting for, whether you're waiting to live or waiting to kill, you're a refugee. We live in Jordan with people who are waiting. We have Palestinian refugees. We have Gaza Palestinian refugees who are a different category. We have Iraqi guests who were never classified as refugees, and we have Syrian refugees in camps and 80% outside of camps. Some people will wait for years. Some people will wait forever. This calls for a massive amount of humility. I find myself in awe of the strength that people have to carry on. I think of the 12-year-old girl with a spinal cord injury who, from here up, she can move, she can speak, she can talk, she can look, but that's it. And the excitement as a woman who took her degree in maths from MIT began to teach her about base 5 numbers. Does anybody know about base 5 numbers? Okay, you have 10 fingers, so you learn to count in tens. If you only had 5 fingers, you have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2. I don't know how to do it either, but it's a different number system. And for this intellectual stimulation, she came alive. I'm in awe of this young woman from MIT who could figure out how to do this. And I'm in awe of the young refugee girl who wants it. She lives now for that. It calls for a massive vision for the future. It calls out the need for a massive humility, the need for a massive vision. In the mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s, we had the opportunity to do all of the programming for young people in the juvenile correctional centers in Jordan. And what we found when we began was quite abysmal. When there are no standards, no vetting of staff, then young people, as in any institution, in any country, become the victims and the sacrifice for an institution that doesn't determine who sees children, who's left alone with children. So one of the first things we were able to do with the cooperation of the Ministry of Ministry of Social Development, Juvenile Corrections, was to fire everybody that worked at night and start with a clean slate. But I know that because of the period of time and because of the things that were going on before we got there, there was a young man who was very likely abused in that system, because no child that we knew ever escaped that kind of abuse. And a decade later, he was beheading Americans in black hoods in Iraq. If you're subjected to that kind of violence, what do we already know about violence when children are subjected to violence? So to live and work among refugees requires a massive vision for the future. To see that what happens today, we will reap what we sow. It also calls for a massive amount of caution, because we may be preparing the next generation for retaliation, not for reconciliation, in the way that we relate to them. How we relate to people who spend their lives waiting is very important. A question for refugees that is not a question that one can ask directly very often, but it's nonetheless a question, is what are you waiting for? Where is your pain? Where are your tears? And when you're dealing with a shucking and jiving 14-year-old, refugee who's made it pretty good in the camp so far, he doesn't have tears. But that's why I would ask, where are your tears? How does it show up? And it's not a verbal question. Because I want to find the place of your pain so I can be committed to you at that place. Because people are waiting because of their pain. Waiting, not really sure what they're waiting for. Waiting for death, waiting to cause death, waiting for life, waiting for a miracle, waiting for a visa, waiting for a ration card. Everybody's got some things that they're waiting for. To establish that kind of relationship in waiting is to restore people to their humanity. If you listen to me, I might get the idea that you might actually think I'm a human being. I might not get it, okay, but I might. In relationship, you could move me from wanting to go and kill and die to help me become a person who will fight a different fight, to build, create other choices, second choices, third choices for you. But your relationship, most of all, will calm down the noise inside of me so that I have the ability to have enough silence to hear. So in a sense, I'm waiting because I'm waiting to be able to hear myself. These are, you can't pick one of these things up that I'm talking about and stack it on top of another one and see how high you can get. It doesn't work like that. But it's nonetheless real. One of the most significant things, now I'm back inside of a refugee camp, but not all refugees live in camps, is, are you being treated fairly in that camp? Are you listened to? All of us have gone to university, right? And in the days before you could do it on your cell phone, you had to line up for cards. It was not terribly unlike being a shorn sheep, okay? You went in and you had to get your cards for your classes. And you would run into, oh, sorry, we're out of cards for that class. And so you start to have to make deals. So you find somebody who has a card for the class. And it's not fair. If you got there earlier or your name started with Aleph or A rather than Z or Z, the luck of the draw, life is just not fair or free or very often fun. But when you live in a system as a refugee, it's even more not fair and not free and not fun. So part of our role as we accompany people who are waiting, and they're waiting because of their pain, and they're waiting because they really don't know why, is to ensure that the systems around them respond to them. That means establishing feedback mechanisms. It means ensuring advocacy. It means that the authority that is over them is accountable to something, to some other authority. If we remember, I said this, one of the things that this calls for is a massive caution and a massive humility. That is actually my responsibility to ensure that you are treated as much as a human being as I would like to be treated. That you are listened to like I would like to be listened to. And these are no longer soft systems. These are very, very definitive, intentional systems to make sure that people are not sidelined or forgotten or put on the side. Which is, after all, a lot of what war is about. Sidelining us, marginalizing us, putting us on the side. To be a refugee, whether you're internally displaced in your country or externally displaced outside, is to enter a long tunnel of waiting. And what happens in that tunnel, at the other end when you come out, is in great part determined by your experiences in that tunnel. The humanitarian system is a better system than having no system. It's a better system this decade than it was last decade. But it can become a better system next year than it is this year. Thank you.
presentations. I would like to welcome up Lizzie Robinson. Lizzie Robinson is a member of the class of 2015, and she's studying economics and international relations. She's a TRIPS coordinator for the IGL's new initiative for Middle East Peace, as well as the co-chair of the China-US Symposium, which is another IGL program. So please help me in welcoming Lizzie.
Again, my name is Lizzie Robinson, and in general, my research was about how the UN interacts with refugees in Jordan's Zaatari camp. I conducted my research through an IGL program called NIMEP, which is the new initiative for Middle East Peace, and I traveled with a group of 8 students to Amman, Jordan for 2 weeks this past winter break. While we were there, we had a series of interviews with journalists, NGO, and government officials, including Killian Kleinschmidt, who is a camp manager at the Zaatari refugee camp. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank a few people who made all this research possible. The Tufts University Institute for Global Leadership, the Tufts Institutional Review Board, Questscope, who was generous enough to host the NIMEP delegation while we were in Amman, and finally the new initiative for Middle East Peace. And as Bruna mentioned earlier, I'm in honor of the 10th anniversary of NIMEP, and in coordination with EPIIC, we are holding a fundraiser on behalf of Questscope. So initially, my research focused on Zaatari's informal economy, and specifically on how the UN was addressing this economy and how it was managing the economy. But after talking with people on the ground in Jordan, I realized that I was asking the wrong question. I realized that because the informal economy is actually run by refugees, I should be asking not how the UNHCR addressed the informal economy, but how it has interacted with the refugees who organize it. With that in mind, I'll now talk a little bit about the camp itself and the economy. So just to begin, as we've heard throughout the symposium so far, there are about 9 million people who have been directly affected by the war in Syria. Of those 9 million, about 600,000 are in Jordan, and only 85,000 are in Zaatari. So when we talk about Zaatari, we're actually talking about a very small portion of the total people who have been affected by the Syrian war. So Zaatari was opened on July 28, 2012, in order to accommodate the refugees who were fleeing the war in Syria. Today the camp spans about 2 square miles, and as I said previously, is populated by about 85,000 people. It's also run by the UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR. The informal economy emerged in Zaatari pretty soon after it opened. It was run by refugees and was not regulated by the UN. There are about 2,500 shops in the camp that sell everything from cigarettes to food to wedding dresses to electrical appliances, and they even offer haircuts. The UN isn't so worried about this aspect of the informal economy. What the UN is worried about is the theft of humanitarian goods, which are smuggled out of the camp and resold, or stolen and redistributed in the camp. A related problem is the theft and vandalism of community goods inside the camp, such as toilets. This creates an atmosphere of disorder, challenges the UN authority and rules, and it also costs money to replace the lost or damaged goods. Before moving on, I'd like to say a quick word about what an informal economy is, because it's a common misperception that an informal economy is necessarily illegal. An informal economy is actually between a formal economy and a criminal economy. An informal economy involves the illegal production and distribution of legal goods. So in Zaatari, the goods such as the clothing and food are legal, but they're smuggled in and the shops aren't regulated or sanctioned by the UN. But despite these illegal aspects, people still do benefit from the informal economy. And this includes refugees, the UN, the government of Jordan, and even Jordanians. In order to answer my research question about how the UN interacts with refugees, it's important to understand the social structures and hierarchies of refugees, which are mainly based on tribal dynamics. Tribes are very important in the Middle East as a whole, and tribal lines and identities actually precede national boundaries and identities. Most of the refugees in Zaatari are from a single city in Syria called Daraa, which is very close to the Jordanian border, as you can see from this map. Because many of the refugees are from the same area, some tribal structures from Daraa are carried over into the camp. Meanwhile, others have been reformed simply because the refugees are very used to living under tribal social structures. There are 3 main tribes in Zatari, and on a very basic level, the tribes which are run by specific leaders, they help resolve disputes in the camp, protect vulnerable families, and maintain order. But these tribal power dynamics have also been really important in shaping the structure of the informal economy. So when Zatari was first opened in July 2012, it was initially run by the Jordanian Hashemite Charity Organization, or JHCO, which is actually affiliated with the Jordanian government. The JHCO did a very poor job of forming positive relationships with the refugees, and corruptions and inefficiencies of its management allowed some of the refugees to establish themselves as leaders or mafias in the camp, and this often occurred along tribal lines. The gangs came to control most of camp life. They controlled everything from the distribution of trailers and humanitarian goods to who could get a job in the camp. One refugee even came to control the real estate market on the main commerce street in the camp and charged exorbitant prices to anyone who wanted to set up a shop there. There was another refugee the electricity boss, who controlled who was able to connect to the main grid in the camp, albeit illegally. So electricity and property are very valuable commodities in the camp, and the refugees who owned them had a lot of power. This created an atmosphere of insecurity, which was very dangerous, and a few aid workers were actually injured in confrontations with the refugees. So to summarize so far, the problem is that there was insecurity in the camp, in large part due to the power of refugee leaders, and much of that power was derived from the informal economy. The JHCO couldn't fix this because they had poor relationships with refugees and no influence over their behavior. So in early 2013, the UNHCR took over from the JHCO in the camp, but the JHCO still operates. In March 2013, Killian Kleinschmidt, whose picture is there, was brought in as the head of UNHCR in Zatari to improve the situation. In our interview, he noted that when he first arrived at the camp, it was, quote, an environment of violence. He said that the refugees rejected the UN authority just like they had rejected the JHCO authority. He said, quote, the level of rejection is extreme. It comes from decades of not having a good relationship with the state. And Killian even noted that he and the UNHCR and the Jordanian government had been compared to Bashar al-Assad by the refugees. Killian Kleinschmidt is very known for making a personal effort in the camp. He walks around, he talks to refugees, and he has team coffee with them. This is all in an effort to get rid of corruption in the camp and build relationships with the refugees. And the main point of contact between the UN and the refugee communities is these refugee leaders in the camp. Originally, these leaders were the mafia bosses who had come to power in the early days of the camp. So this is a pretty cool map. It's produced by ACTED, which is another one of the organizations operating Zatari. It shows the refugee leaders in the camp and where they have control of the specific streets or sections. And I know it's really hard to see, but on the far right side, that's actually a list of all of their names and their phone numbers. And Andreas Needham, who is a UNHCR press officer, said about this that the street leaders were self-appointed in the early days of the camp. Therefore, UNHCR has inherited the structure. They claim to represent refugees, but the governance plan will put in place structures to represent refugees democratically. So this effort at democratic representation of refugees is actually part of a larger governance plan that the UN is trying to install in Zatari. And the main goal of this governance plan is to improve the security of the camp. However, this governance plan represents an alternative structure to the one that's already in place in the camp and was established by the refugees. The refugee leaders feel that their power and authority is challenged by the UN system, which is trying to erode the control of the informal economy, and this creates a lot of tension in the camp. Moreover, the UNHCR structure is often culturally at odds with the population it's serving. For instance, the UN has organized the camp organized the trailers in the camp in very straight lines, but when refugees receive a trailer, they often move them to be closer to their family because that family structure and family ties are very important. The UN does consult refugees through household surveys and focus groups, but the refugees are not involved enough at the beginning of this program planning process. For this reason, they have no ownership or stake in this alternative UN structure and then less of incentive to go along with it. So this is where a lot of the violence and insecurity comes from. So why not change your process to be more flexible and to better accommodate the refugees? This is really hard. The UN has been around for over 60 years and serves over 10 million refugees around the world. In order to operate on this scale, they rely on a standardized method of doing things. However, this formulaic approach ignores culture, and it is determined by the desires of donors and not necessarily the needs of refugees. And Zatri is a great example of the failure of this approach. Today in the camp, there has been a lot of progress in terms of security, but it hasn't been a complete turnaround. Police in the camp still won't let visitors into the very middle, which is the most dangerous section. There's still a lot of theft of community goods, and one person we spoke to in Jordan noted that if a real problem arose, the UN doesn't have enough influence to really change the behavior of the refugee leaders. To conclude, I'd like to talk for a moment about the big picture. This presentation has been about how to manage a refugee camp. But regardless of the management quality, it's still a camp. The refugees still don't want to be there, and they still want to go home. No matter how well it's run, a refugee camp is not a permanent solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. I would now like to invite up Umar Sharif, who is a first year here at Tufts, also a member of our Colloquium class, and he's studying political science.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Umar Sharif, and I'm a first year here at Tufts. Before I begin, I would like to thank Sherman Teichman, Heather Berry, and the IGL staff for funding and providing me with this research opportunity. I would also like to thank the Questscope staff, Dr. Curt Rhodes, Muthanna, the Syrian participants, and the IRB for facilitating my research. And last but not least, I would like to thank the wonderful Mike Nittenchuk for being a great advisor, a great mentor, and a great friend. Thank you all. This past winter, I traveled to Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, where I explored the relationship between spirituality and resilience. This picture is of me in the camp with 3 refugees who are showing me around the camp. My research question was, what is the relationship between spirituality and resilience, and how is it affected by displacement, specifically in young men in the Zaatari camp? This topic is of interest to me because as a Muslim American, spirituality was always important and complicated. It was complicated in the sense of how does one define spirituality and how does one measure spirituality? Some brief contextual information about the camp. As of now, there are more than 85,000 refugees living in the camp. I interviewed 7 of them, 1 to 2 hours each, through the help of Questscope. All of the people that are interviewed are originally from Dar'a Governorate, a region that touches the border of Jordan. But some were living in Damascus at the time of their displacement. Now, my definition of spirituality. My definition, which was separate from religion, was part of a developmental process that aims to place the self in a broader context of meaning. And as you can see from that definition, the idea of meaning is very important. In fact, in all of my interview questions, I focus on sources of meaning in the refugees' lives and how it gives them strength, hope, and structure in their new life. All of the people that I interviewed said that relationships, especially family relationships, is a source of meaning and a central aspect of their spirituality. Relationships is a vehicle, a mode that places them, the people that are interviewed in a broader context. And being in this broader context is meaningful for them. As for resilience, I define it as a set of qualities that help a person withstand the negative effects of adversity. Resilient qualities can be developed throughout an individual's lifetime. Of them are meaningful relationships, trust, and a secure base. As you can see, common to both spirituality and resilience is relationships. And I explored this aspect of spirituality, its effect on priorities, and how it has changed from Syria to the camp. A change in relationships. 5 of the people that are interviewed said that their relationships have gotten stronger because of the space constraint. And specifically, I'm talking about family relationships. Having to live so close to each other forces them to develop dependable relationships. Two of them, and let's call them Amr and Yusuf, said that their relationships have gotten weaker. For Amr, his role in his family is no longer the same. In Syria, he was not responsible to financially support his parents and his siblings. That was his father's role. But in the camp, he is now the primary provider. And this burdens him heavily, especially since he recently married before he came to the camp. Some days, he told me, he feels very overwhelmed having to provide for so many. As for Yusuf, he no longer lives with his family, but because he came to the camp at a different time. He says about his family, "We live near each other, but there is still some distance between us. I don't see them every day. It's not the same interaction as it was in Syria. There, every meal, everything was done together in the same space. Here, there's a distance." All of the people that I interviewed also said that their relationship with friends have been negatively affected, and that building new relationships have become much more difficult in the camp. One of them said that new relationships have become more shallow because there's a lack of trust, which makes possible only simple interactions. Furthermore, relationships are complicated by the change in priorities. The priority to protect and provide for the family have become more important and more urgent because of the survival instinct. And this means that when food and security and other human necessities are scarce, then these human necessities become much more important. As one of the people that I interviewed said, essentially people become more selfish. Priorities change. Priorities are contextual. For example, if the context is dangerous, then the priority to protect is more important. There's a strong and complex relationship between where we derive our meaning and how we make our priorities. In the camp, relationships have changed, and people now find themselves in a new society with very different people, and it becomes harder to place themselves in a broader context. Also, because there's a lack of physical, social, and economic resources, people, priorities have become more selfish. In fact, in the camp, there's a cyclical relationship between priorities and sources of meaning, whereby selfish priorities encourage weaker relationships, and weaker relationships encourage selfish priorities. And I would like to conclude here that in the context of Zatari, relationships as a source of meaning and as a spiritual quality has been negatively affected. As Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist in the Holocaust survival, says, sources of meaning create structure by which we live by, and a change in that source of meaning can be incredibly destabilizing. Consequently, many feel less spiritually healthy. Meaningful relationships, some of which have been preserved, have helped the people that are interviewed cope with the new circumstances. Those with stronger relationships in the camp were more content than those without. For this group, relationships was a central part of spiritual health and of resilience. As for Questscope already trains their Syrian caseworkers in spiritual formation, which includes topics like empathy, forgiveness, self-reflection, and emotional development. And it's in this connection that I advocate for agencies in the camp to adopt spiritual formation to supplement spiritual formation programs to their program to strengthen relationships and hopefully develop resilience. Thank you all.
Lastly, we will hear from Victoria Martin and Adrienne. Victoria is a sophomore from Wakefield, Massachusetts, majoring in international relations with a concentration in international security. She has been a member of the Power and Poverty Research Initiative since 2013 and is a member of the Tufts University Refugee Assistance Program, and she hopes to continue working with refugees and development issues in Jordan and in the Middle East. Adrienne is a sophomore from Washington, D.C., majoring in community health and international relations and minoring in economics. She's volunteered before in Thailand, West Africa, Haiti, and Mexico. She's a Belgian American and enjoys learning new languages.
Good afternoon and welcome to this year's EPIIC Symposium. Through the Power and Poverty Research Initiative, Adrienne and I spent 2 weeks this past winter break, January 2014, in Amman, Jordan, looking into a variety of cash aid programs to Syrian refugees. While cash aid requires that certain systems be in place in order to function well, it still has the potential to be an extremely effective form of humanitarian aid. We will speak specifically about a cash aid program implemented by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, or UNHCR, because it is one of the largest and most comprehensive cash aid programs. In 2013 alone, the UNHCR has provided financial assistance to over 32,000 families. The UNHCR runs 2 concurrent cash aid programs. The first is the Urgent Cash Assistance Program, a one-time lump sum cash aid. This one-time cash amount is designed to provide immediate assistance for sudden emergencies or to help sustain the beneficiary until their application for long-term aid is approved. According to the UNHCR employees that we spoke with, the idea is for the applicants to come in, fill out the application and paperwork, and be sent upstairs to the finance department to receive their money within 15 minutes. The other type of UNHCR cash assistance is the monthly aid, which is comprised of the bulk of our research. Monthly cash aid programs started back in 2008 for Syrian and Iraqi refugees living in Jordan. The UNHCR's main implementing partners are the Cairo Amman Bank and International Relief and Development. The process begins with a vulnerability assessment and home visit by UNHCR officials. Typical vulnerability criteria include, but are not limited to, female-headed households, households where the primary provider is injured, or households with a monthly income less than 60 Jordanian dinar, the local currency, per month. The UNHCR typically receives up to 5,000 applications per month from beneficiaries in both rural and urban areas. The UNHCR also highlighted that beneficiaries must be present in the country to receive the cash regularly. While other humanitarian organizations are subject to a Jordanian law requiring that a certain percentage of their distribution aid, ranging from 20 to 40% of the aid based on the agency that we spoke with, go to vulnerable Jordanians, this quota does not apply to the UNHCR's cash aid program.
So, our original research question looked into the potential for corruption and misuse within the cash aid program. We had 2 prior assumptions before traveling to Jordan, namely that an influx of cash aid would be detrimental to the local economy and simply infeasible. We also assumed that there would be widespread contraband associated with the cash assistance. However, after speaking with UNHCR officials, we found these concerns to be generally less significant than previously thought. In fact, we found that cash aid to be the most effective form of aid in this particular refugee conflict. One principal reason for this is due to the nature of the Syrian war, which, as we heard from our distinguished panelists last night, is a protracted conflict with no foreseeable end. In this way, we now have a situation of over 500,000 refugees living in Jordan, over 70% of which live in urban areas. Cash aid works well in a long-term conflict like this, where refugees are living in the host communities for extended periods of time. In particular in Jordan, where refugees aren't allowed to work and many vocational training programs where NGOs are banned, cash aid is the most effective option.
So one of our principal assumptions was that an influx of cash to the local economy would be detrimental. However, we found that Jordan had the necessary infrastructure in place, namely a sound banking system, as well as a sound currency, the Jordanian dinar, to make cash programs effective. Another assumption we had, the potential for contraband, was also proven to be less severe than previously thought. The average monthly sum received by the UNHCR program is about 500 to 120 Jordanian dinar. However, monthly rent paid by Syrians, well above the market price, is around 150 Jordanian dinar. Therefore, most Syrians living in urban areas in Jordan are just struggling to meet their basic needs, and therefore, the small sum they receive from the UNHCR is not worth the risk of smuggling to Syria. And this notion was confirmed when Tori and I actually visited Syrian homes and saw the difficult conditions that most of these people are living in. Moreover, one very important aspect of cash assistance that makes it an extremely effective form of aid in this particular crisis is the fact that it's empowering. When refugees have the agency to decide for themselves how to best prioritize their needs, they're more likely to live to meet their needs better. The most overwhelming need that we found present among the Syrian refugees was money for rent, for which direct cash aid is the most viable option. Moreover, most Syrians have specific dietary needs and regimes for which traditional food vouchers simply would not work. Therefore, because of the empowering nature of cash aid, cash assistance is the most effective form of aid in this particular conflict.
One of the biggest risks highlighted by the UNHCR is the lack of information about the results of the program. Because it is relatively new, the UNHCR is still working to gather data on how the program affects beneficiaries and local populations and how the influx of cash has on the local market. Another important issue that arose was double dipping, or when beneficiaries apply for cash assistance from more than one organization. The UNHCR employees cited mechanisms such as the Refugee Assistance Information System, or RAISE, which is used to coordinate information among NGOs working on refugee assistance in Jordan as one way to avoid this double dipping. Yet not all agencies are linked up to the system, so it only works so far as the NGOs adopt it. Another risk area is fraud. The cash used to be distributed through ATM cards with predetermined PIN numbers, but problems arose when Syrian refugees who didn't know how to use the ATM cards would ask for help, only to have the person helping them take the money. In response to this, the UNHCR implemented an iris scanning program to ensure that beneficiaries are the correct recipients of the cash assistance.
So in conclusion, we found that because of the protracted nature of the Syrian conflict, the fact that Jordan has the necessary infrastructure in place, such as a sound banking system and stable currency, and because of the empowering nature of cash aid, cash assistance is the most effective form of aid in this particular refugee conflict. We would like to thank the Institutional Review Board, as well as the Institute for Global Leadership, for this opportunity to do our research. And a particular thanks to Heather Berry and Chairman Teichman for their support and guidance. Thank you.
We're now going to open up to the panelists if you guys have any questions for each other. Okay. So just to remind you how questions work here, if you do have a question, you have 1 minute to present your question. Please make sure it is a question and not a comment, and direct them at one panelist.
My name is Yasser. I'm part of EPIIC 2014. My question is to Dr. Ayari. How do you see the developments with the smuggling groups, with these smuggling communities along the borders, in Tunisia, along the borders with Algeria and Libya? And what is how the Salafists and the Jihadist groups are interacting with these groups? We know that there is a huge propaganda or dawah campaign toward the Tunisian community to co-opt into these movements. And are there any attempts to co-opt these groups like we saw in Syria and Iraq? And how the the financial incentive of these groups will affect the decision of these groups to join or not to join the effort of the jihadists in the future, if there is any? Thank you.
Yes, in fact, as I tried to say before, it's contraband and smugglers. It's not a new phenomenon in Tunisia. Those were it's been like that since they are border, they are smugglers. You know? So the problem is that as the pact that I told at the beginning has been broken, there are more dangerous goods and there are more smugglers. In fact, even if they are regulated, but they are not jihadists at all. It means the West, they are more, could I say, secular oriented, you know, they drink alcohol, they are more like the same mentality that the Algerian from the East, you know, like that. And people in the South, it's not a question of jihadism, of Islamism, they are tribes. You know, you don't enter in smuggling like that. You know, in the South you have to be from this tribe, or Toisin, or Derna, and in the West you need to have links. So I said that there is the possibility that jihadists, Islamo-gangsterism that I told before, who are more and more powerful in popular districts. You know, but in the poorer districts, but inside Tunisia. You know, and these people, they are originate from this region, these border regions, you know, and because of the rural exode, they have been in peripheric areas, you know, of big cities like Tunis, especially. So what I told, if nothing is done in terms of infrastructure, all that stuff I told before, there is this risk that these people gain more and more importance in the smuggling, you know, and all collaborate actively with the smugglers, and we have a situation comparable at a certain extent with Mali or something like that in terms of dynamics. And the cooptation, I didn't understand. What did you mean by cooptation? Cooptation of groups? I didn't understand.
Right, wasn't clear on that. Like in Iraq, for example, these groups were independent. They drank alcohol, they had parties in the desert, and they're a lot of fun. But after these groups controlled Anbar, they co-opted them, they made them part of them because they offered them bigger incentives that changed their calculations, either by money, paying them money, or by forcing them to work with them. And that's what I'm trying to see if it's the same, if there's a possibility that the same scenario will play.
For the moment, it's not at this step. No, it's not at this step. You know, when we say that we have armed groups, you know, in Tunisia, it's not many. You know, for example, in the Jebel Shambi, it's a mountain in Tunisia, but a small one. You know, just 40 kilometers of large and 1,500 meters of height. You know, it's not the Maquis, you know, not the Sierra Maestra, or I don't know the Roches, you know, in Canada. You know, it's just small places. And in this area, there were much more than 100 jihadists. That's all, at the maximum, you know, 50 or 100 jihadists, you know. So there are not groups. There are people say, Nigerians especially, they are very worried because they say that in the sixth district of Al-Qaeda, the fifth one is Tebessa, you know, and the sixth one is Tunisia. And you know the strategic importance of Tunisia for Algeria. You have to remember that French, at this border, they built the Maurice line. It's an electrified line, you know, of 400 kilometers, you know, and nobody could enter there during the Algerian War of Independence. So there is the problem of ammunitions and the weapons, because there are some weapons that come through Tunisia, even if the most weapons come directly from the desert, you know, directly from Libya to Algeria, but there are problems of ammunition, so they are very worried. And they are especially worried that they can build an alliance between poor people of the East Algerians and poor people of the West Tunisian, you know, and that can develop a free zone that will be able for a free zone in terms of states to host real jihadist groups for the moment. But it's not, we are just at the beginning of a process, you know. You're welcome.
I'm a member of the 2014 Colloquium. I have a question for the presentation on cash aid from the UN. So personally, I've worked with the IDP camps in Kabul, and I've worked with the internally displaced people who have come from the province of Helmand to Kabul. And throughout my work with a U.S. organization, we have realized that supplying cash to the refugees is not the most beneficial way to help the economy of the people and how to improve their lives. Because what happens when you provide cash to people is that you promote a culture of dependence on this cash. You do not require them to do anything in return for that cash. And so what you do is that when, for example, even if these refugees go back to, for example, Syria, when they're in Syria, they will not have the means to work because they've been dependent of this continuous supply of money from the UN. So I would like to ask your take on this issue.
Yes, it's actually really interesting because based on what it sounds like your question is, actually the situation is unique in Jordan because like humanitarian aid organizations can't do vocational training, so they are not allowed to help the Syrian refugees do any type of training that's going to get them a job, either in Jordan or back in Syria, from what we understood with the agencies that we worked with. So really there is no option for them to do any type of job training because they're not allowed to work in Jordan. So really, based on, with the rent being like the biggest need that they had, that the cash aid was really one of the only means that they had to meet those needs for the refugees because they weren't allowed to give them any job training.
But has the UN thought about the repercussions of this decision?
I mean, we didn't ask them personally, but based on what we understood is that they seem to be in a really tough spot where they can't give any type of job training. So the ones that we spoke with said that this was the best option given the situation. No problem.
Short, okay, sorry. My question is to Dr. Warde. Sorry. Sorry, you had a little bit of a cliffhanger in your speech about the unintended consequences of distributing money, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Actually, the main problem, and it's been a dilemma of foreign policy in general, American foreign policy, is to create more enemies than we need, basically. Okay, so, and that's been the phenomenon from the beginning again, probably if we date it to the Afghan jihad, that's a good starting point, where, again, initially it looked like a brilliant idea to try and help the Mujahideen drive out the Soviets from Afghanistan, and in the process there was again this creation of essentially Al-Qaeda as well as other similar groups. Now, what we have now is not necessarily the broadening of Al-Qaeda in an organizational sense, but the creation of Al-Qaeda franchises elsewhere. We have groups who get inspired by that. And the implication of what I was talking about is that the more you have this kind of indiscriminate, open-minded, open-ended system of spreading money and weapons around, the more you're going to make enemies that were not initially your enemies. Another example is, so money is fungible. It can kind of take a different form. You can't trace what happens to the money based on what was given initially. And very often first of all, one possible consequence is that money can fall into the wrong hands. And then money can easily be converted into weapons, etc. And then the weapons stay. If we look at the unintended consequences, say, of what happened in Libya, you had an extension of the jihad to other areas. You had more weapons coming out of Libya and going to Mali and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So the more you participate in that game of trying to help certain groups without thinking about the consequences, then the more likely the war will spread to other areas that were initially spared. And if you want to look specifically at the financial war on terror in terms of the unintended consequences, it is all the groups who started looking at the US as the enemy, whereas initially the US was not regarded as their enemy. So you have this open-ended process, and unfortunately, I don't think there's been a lot of thinking about that. Every time there is some enthusiasm for an operation, whether military or financial. Right now, everybody is concerned about the Ukraine, and it's an easy thing to predict that very soon there are going to be some economic sanctions against Russia because of that. So it's become almost the default reflex, whereby every time there is something that we disapprove of, then since we cannot send troops everywhere, then we're going to impose financial sanctions. And the corollary to those financial sanctions is going to be some financial help to the good guys. And that's why it's become almost a never-ending process of radicalization.
Thank you.
Hi, first I'd like to thank all our panelists for being here today. My name is Gabriela Zaya and I'm a part of the 2014 EPIIC Symposium. And my question goes to you, Mr. Warde. So I lived in Qatar for the past 2 years and I saw sort of firsthand the relationship that the people had with the state. And what I saw was that when the people started to become very discontent with the emir for sort of, as you said, punching upon its weight, the government responded by increasing the wages of the Qataris by 80% and increasing the wages of those in the military by 120%. And so my question for you is, what has been the rationale behind the Qatari policy in Syria, buying Paris Saint-Germain in Paris and funding the Shard in London, and what implication that has for the domestic populace, since it only constitutes 15% of the population, and 50% of the population are migrant workers that live in slave conditions that is being sort of covered by the media but not really, and what is the implication for this going forward?
Okay, these are very interesting and important questions, and the answers will probably differ based on, again, the various stages of your questions, because I think part of those gifts of cash and other valuables to the Qatari population is something that has happened throughout the Gulf region in the wake of the Arab Spring. And essentially, the easy explanation of that was a way of buying off discontent, and rather than having people demonstrate against the government, etc., then the government would appear as having given them all those goodies. Okay, that's one aspect. Now, the other thing about Qatar's involvement in foreign policy, then it's a very interesting question, because here again, I think there are a number of different angles. One of them is, again, Qatar's desire to almost rival Saudi Arabia in terms of its international influence. And initially, it was primarily a matter of financial influence trying to play a role in global finance, etc. And some of Qatar's international investments are probably part of that phenomenon. There are other transactions in Qatar, as in many financial transactions in that region, that are commission-driven, meaning that you buy something big, not necessarily because it makes strategic sense, but because a number of influential people are likely to benefit from that. Okay, and unfortunately, it's also relevant to other aspects of this panel. Very often when you look at arms sales, especially again in the Gulf region, very often what drives those arms sales is the commissions that are going to be pocketed. Now, the subsidiary element of that is that you do get a whole set of rationalizations in the form of seeing threats or exaggerating threats, etc., that serve to legitimate those transactions that initially were motivated by commissions. And then there is this whole issue about the role of Al Jazeera, the role of Qatar in the Arab Spring. And it sounded initially like Qatar wanted to be the champion of the Arab Spring, in that it sided with again, Tunisia and Egypt against their deposed leaders. And then I think what happened was that there was a complete loss of focus in that when things started to degenerate, especially with Libya, and Qatar was very influential in Libya as well, and then Syria, then you had a combination of religious factors alongside with regional politics factors, and it blurred the whole picture. And I'm not sure that even the Qataris themselves knew what they were doing in the end, because here the most obvious example is Egypt, where you had the Qataris being the allies of the Morsi regime, of the Muslim Brothers, whereas the Saudis sided with the old regime, with Mubarak, and later lent their support, their financial support to the Sisi coup, okay, the so-called democratic coup on July 3rd of 2013. So again, it's a combination of factors, and there's also the issue of the change in leadership in Qatar, which some people trace to the fact that Qatari foreign policy had gotten out of control, in that the ruler, the Qatari ruler, abdicated in favor of his son in a very sudden way. And in a way, it was good news in a region where there are presidencies for life, essentially. And but at the same time, if you try and figure out what was behind that transfer of power, it really sounded a lot like the nervousness of neighbors in the region about what Qatar was doing, and the fact that they didn't seem to be in control of the consequences of their policies. Here again, where we get back to the unintended consequences of meddling.
Thank you.
My name is Linda Caro, and my question is for Mr. Rhodes. I found it very intriguing that attitudes could be changed on the way out of a refugee camp. And I'm wondering if that could possibly apply to prisons where extremists are located. The Saudis have a program to convert people's attitudes in effect. And I wonder if something like that could be extended to prisons, or if they're just too extreme.
It sort of depends on what you went to prison for. Political prisoner. Most of my experience is related to people under 18 or at the most under 21, the juveniles. Actually, the same things that allow a refugee to grow by being listened to, taken seriously, talked to, and develop a critical consciousness about. I liked your comment, Dr. Warde, about can I take responsibility for my actions? Qatar medals, can they control the results? Well, an individual is like that also. So that actually the things that we used with the refugee population were developed in the juvenile correctional centers among juvenile, we can't say inmates for juveniles, but you know what I'm saying. But that's a very astute observation that you brought up. Thank you for doing that.
Hi, my name is Vinod and I'm from the Singaporean delegation. My question is for Mr. Rhodes as well as for Omar. I know that your presentation was on spirituality, but I got a question in regards to religion. Religion can be a powerful healing force, but in your experience in the refugee camp, how has people's faith and belief in religion changed over time? Because I'm sure with the constant adversity, some people's faith may have declined, and how do you see this happening?
Omar, that's a good question for you, isn't it? Thank you very much. We'll deal with that tomorrow. This is a very, very deep question.
But I'll be leaving tomorrow.
Yeah, that was my point. Okay. You can always wiggle out of it in some way. The conceptualizing spirituality without a need for dogma. Okay? The need for dogma, and I say that with complete respect. People have choose belief systems, or they're raised in belief systems that becomes a matter of conscience, their conscience. So I cannot actually make you change your belief and your belief system, because you will die for that. You know, the history of at least modern Western civilization is about people either dying for it or killing for it. So we try to actually separate the practice of a set of practices defined by dogma. We try to separate that from some of the words that Omar used, like forgiveness, and reconciliation, and restoration to relationship. One of the things that does happen, particularly with young males, is that when you discover relationships in which you experience forgiveness and you experience reconciliation and restoration, you may become more religious. But it's you will pray more, you will be more respectful to your mother, which is, very important. So it becomes an outcome of an inward change. So we don't actually want to discuss what your outcome should look like. What we want to continue to talk about is the inner change. Am I on target, Omar, or am I missing about here?
I personally did not look into the change in religion because of the sensitivities around religion. So I was coming from spirituality from a secular perspective, like Dr. Curt Rhodes was mentioning. So I never really got to ask the people that I interviewed, how does your religion, how does the manifestation of your religion change? How has your relationship with God changed? Because these are very personal questions, first and foremost. And so, I don't have an answer for it.
It's fair.
But I will add, because again, your question is really one of the best that I've heard in a long time about this topic, is it the reports that other people make of young people. So the moms, the dads, the aunties, the grandmothers, the brothers, the sisters, they will tell you things that they see as obvious changes. He does go to mosque now, and he doesn't curse. Those are observable changes, which reassure us that the emphasis that we have put on the internal spiritual growth of a person, they may be causal and not associative, but not causal. But other people can see that somebody's different. Yeah, very, very good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the speakers for being here today. My name is Ali, I'm a senior here at Tufts. My question is for Dr. Ayari. Earlier today you mentioned that most of the individuals who live near the borders in Tunisia are of the poorest in the nation. My question is, I wonder, to what extent does clamping down on smuggling and removing the only source of income that comes to the way of these people, to what extent does that sort of ripen the area for further illegitimate economic activity, and maybe push the current illegitimate economic activity further underground?
Excuse me, you speak very fast. It was very difficult for her. What's your name? I'm so sorry?
Ali.
Ali, okay. Sorry, I didn't understand everything. Can you repeat it?
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that the individuals who live near the borders in Tunisia are of the poorest in the area. And I wonder, to what extent does removing the only source of income coming their way, to what extent does that ripen the area for further illegitimate economic activity, or push the current illegitimate economic activity further underground?
Yes, if I understood, you mean to what extent if the state forbid, for example, smuggling there, will it create problems, you mean? And what is the alternative? Is that yet?
Absolutely.
Okay, understood. Yes, it was one of my arguments is to say that it's impossible to remove, but the difference is that they have to control these activities, because the problem is it's dangerous good, and the problem is when there are too much smuggling, and sometimes we see that this smuggling this contraband is linked to the absurdity of the trade politics, between the Maghreb, the country of the Maghreb, because of the tax and everything. It's a complex question, Now, if there is a solution, it's not. It won't eradicate contraband. It's impossible. we know, but it will regulate it more, and especially in terms of its security terms. It's the creation of like free zone, like Dubai, like a duty-free, zone like that, and smuggling themselves, they want that. It's very surprising to say that, astonished, but smugglers themselves, they just want to be active, in this process. But they say, okay, we're ready for free zone, we're ready to be, and gradually, the state will be able to come back. The state will say, okay, we're going to build roads, okay, we're going to build some infrastructures, and it will be the excuse, to control and to rebuild the intelligence network that was before, and that helped, Tunisia to save itself from jihadists and violence. That's it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bradley Friedman. I'm a junior in the EPIIC class this year, and my question is for Dr. Warde. So you mentioned that one of the unintended consequences of targeting Islamic charities is they go under, a lot of their funds go underground. So can you elaborate on, not necessarily just for charities, but this underground illicit money transfers, like what exactly happens, how does it work? And then I guess specifically, does that ever relate to like Koala systems, mobile money transfers? So that's
Yes, your question is about the process of going underground, which has been, again, at least an implicit part of many of the questions that were asked. In that, officially the policy is one of encouraging transparency and openness. The reality, however, is that very often the way the rules are made and come about is so arbitrary and capricious that it strikes fear in the heart of many of the people involved in the process. In other words, because of the kinds of laws that were passed following September 11, a number of things were criminalized that were not criminalized before, or at least things that would get you in trouble, in that there was a system of declaring that a given group is a terrorist or has links to terror, which is a very nebulous concept. Then if you give some money to that group, then that would potentially turn you into a terrorist as well. And here there's this interesting phenomenon whereby calling someone a terrorist has become the easy way of trying to get rid of that person. Again, another good example is what's happened in Egypt following the recent coup, which is to declare that the Muslim Brothers are all terrorists. So therefore, everybody who is associated with them is a terrorist. Now, my favorite illustration of the ease with which the terrorist label can be slapped upon anybody happened with Iceland a few years ago, when Iceland had its banking crash, and it so happened that a number of Icelandic banks had encouraged or advertised their services in England so that British depositors would move their money from their bank to Icelandic banks. And then after a few years, of course, their money had vanished. So the British government had no way of forcing Iceland to pay off all those depositors. So what the British government did was to essentially declare Iceland a terrorist nation. And using its anti-terrorist laws, they were able to seize whatever Icelandic money happened to be in the UK. So the same phenomenon happened, greatly magnified post-September 11, where many groups were designated as being supporters of terrorism. And the process for being delisted was very complicated, so that if you had been listed as a terrorist, then chances were, unless you were very wealthy, able to finance kind of a delisting operation, then you would remain on those lists. So as a result, there was a climate of panic, given that many of the groups that were on those lists were Islamic charities. So that's again, the part dealing with Islamic charities. The part dealing with Hawala is also something that came out in the open following September 11. Hawalas are very simply like Western Union. So there are systems of money transfers. And in most cases, probably in 99% of the cases, it was very legitimate transfers. Typically, you would have people from India or Pakistan living in Dubai or Saudi Arabia who'd be wiring their money home. And instead of going through banks or through Western Union, they would go through those networks of hawala. Now, I think that some people, again, in the foreign policy establishment, liked the sound of the word hawala. So they thought there must have been something very sinister about it. And it became something synonymous to terrorism. And so hawalas were essentially forced to have a system of documentation and regulation so as to control their operations. But the reality of it is that they did not disappear. They again went further underground, many of them.
Alright, because of time, we're going to have to take the last two questions at the same time, so you can go state your questions and then each of our panelists will have to answer your question.
That's awesome. Because I think it was for Dr. Warde. I heard common themes with everyone that spoke today, and that was sort of what happens in a vacuum, the human propensity to create something from nothing, decentralization and authority changes, et cetera, et cetera. And Mr. Rhodes, you spoke about asking a refugee like what they needed, and we spoke about where money goes, and when you include people. I'm wondering if you know if there's anyone doing it, or if this would be something to explore, as there's so much inequality, and there's so much aid, and things are so bad. With what happened in Syria, giving them the money, a way to marry this idea of sort of addressing the refugees, asking them what you need, with foreign aid, decentralizing foreign aid, and literally bringing it right to the ground where it might be the most effective, including people that would be on the fringes to act as go-betweens, as they do in Tunis with smugglers. And if that would be a better model to explore, it just seems like the bigger it is, the worse it is. Dr. Warde, I don't know if you would agree with that. I don't even know if I made myself understood. I hope so. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ziyan from Key University Delegation. My question is for Mr. Rhodes. First of all, I would like to thank you for your work with Questscope. And my question is, how do you balance what the big donors want and what the refugees want? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, concerning the question about doing things differently, unfortunately, one reason why things are so dysfunctional remind me of a famous line by a famous French sociologist who was talking about how policies are completely dysfunctional as far as France is concerned, but they're perfectly functional in terms of the bureaucracy that administers them. In other words, there are a number of people actually who do benefit from the current status quo, dysfunctional as it is. So, for example, if you are in the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing establishment, you have daily occasions to congratulate yourself about the wonderful job you're doing. Okay? And this is simply because these bureaucracies tend to look at the so-called busyness of their actions, in that they're constantly saying things and doing things that look like they're doing something about it without paying attention to the consequences. Now, another example, there were lots of references to foreign aid and the role of the donors internationally. Now, I happen to have been doing a lot of work on the role of regional development banks, as well as development banks in general, in the Arab Spring. And I saw the same kind of dysfunctional behavior, in that you have lots of bad policies that are being perpetuated. And for example, I'm sure that when future historians write the history of the Egyptian evolution after the Arab Spring, organizations such as the IMF will have a lot to answer for. Because here, very briefly, there was a big $4.8 billion loan that was going to be given by the IMF to Egypt. And the IMF kept insisting that the Egyptian government, the then democratically elected, had to remove all sorts of subsidies, which is political suicide for anybody who knows anything about Egypt. It was a way of making sure that the Arab Spring never works the way it's supposed to. And it was a way of facilitating the counter-revolution. So the short answer to your question is that there should be a better understanding of what's going on and trying to think outside the box regardless of what the major players in the game are saying.
The answer would take us a couple of days to the individual who's here. Rather than be prescriptive or proscriptive, I'll say that there are three things that would help in the delivery of international aid. One is that we would create more space for the agency of people themselves to affect what happens. The choice of the design of what happens to them, or is made as an offering to them. So you make a space for it, and then you make it progressive. You fix it so that it can increase, so it doesn't stay static, the agency. And the third is accountable. Our international funders are not accountable. Funding is run on the basis of fashion and idea. So do you as a donor, require me to be accountable. I gave you my theory of change and you made me create the evidence for it. Well, if the shoe fits, both of us could wear it. You should be accountable too. The question about how do we balance between donors and what was the exact wording was, what was your exact wording? But you don't have to balance it because of the golden rule. The guy who has the gold makes the rule, okay? So you have to keep it. Organizations simply have to work harder. So you have to create more evidence that something works that you're doing, okay? The nice thing about a fora like this is that you can talk about things that maybe wouldn't be discussed or discussable. Thank you. There need to be new fora. There need to be places like this where people will talk about stuff that we don't usually talk about, so we can get it into the public discourse.